They had no flag to rally behind, no anthem to stir their hearts, no kingdom to call their own. And yet for nearly 2 centuries, their very name was enough to pull kings from their sleep in the dead of night, sweating, trembling, haunted by the thought of an unseen hand reaching for their throat. They were not an empire, nor an army. They were something far more chilling, an idea sharpened into flesh, a whisper turned into a dagger. History would remember them as the assassins, but who they truly were is far more unsettling than the stories that came after. Tonight, I invite you not only to revisit their story, but to feel the silence they left behind. A silence more terrifying than the sound of war. So close your eyes if you dare and stay with me until the end. Because once you step into the world of the assassins, you may never feel safe again, and the question they left behind still haunts us today. The 11th century was a world carved open by steel and ambition. To the west, the crusaders surged across the Holy Land, carrying the cross, but also greed for conquest. To the east, the Seljuk Turks ruled a vast empire from Persia to Anatolia, tightening their grip over both politics and faith. The Abbasid Caliph still sat in Baghdad, cloaked in spiritual authority, though his real power crumbled like sand. Everywhere, the strong devoured the weak, and the common people lived under the shadow of armies, with little choice but to bow their heads and survive. It was in this world, torn between swords and scripture, that a man named Hassan-i Sabbah emerged. Hassan was not a warrior in the traditional sense. He did not march at the head of armies. He was not a prophet seeking to carve a new religion. He was, instead, something that frightened rulers even more. A thinker who refused to bow, a strategist who saw through the illusions of power. Brilliant, devout, yet unyielding, Hassan questioned the religious order of his day. He challenged the scholars who bent faith into chains of control. For his defiance, he was cast out, condemned as a heretic. But exile can be a curse, or it can be the birth of something unstoppable. For Hassan, it became the sharpening of a blade, invisible yet lethal. High in the Alborz mountains of Persia lay a fortress called Alamut. Perched on cliffs that seemed to pierce the clouds, it was more than stone walls and towers. It was a riddle carved into rock, a place where only one narrow path led to its gates, and once inside, few ever left unchanged. Hassan seized Alamut not with brute force, but with cunning, conviction, and vision. From its cold halls and hidden chambers, he built not an army of soldiers, but a brotherhood of believers. Inside Alamut, recruits, some no older than boys, were not trained merely to kill. They were trained to think, to believe, to understand why death might be worth more than life. They studied philosophy, theology, mathematics, cryptography. They memorized texts forbidden elsewhere, debated the nature of power, faith, and justice. They were not whipped into blind obedience. They were persuaded, molded, reborn. And when the time came, they were ready to give their lives not for coin, not for fame, but for an idea. Hassan called them the Fida, the self-sacrificing ones. To the outside world, their enemies twisted the name into Hashashin, users of hashish, madmen high on drugs. But that slur could not erase the truth. They were men who embraced death with calm, steady eyes, and that terrified the world more than any army ever could. Imagine for a moment being a king in that age. You sit on your throne, surrounded by guards, your banners fluttering above cities, your name etched in coins of silver. You believe yourself untouchable, but then you hear a whisper. A vizier struck down on pilgrimage, a general stabbed in his chamber, a prince cut down in the street, and each time, the killer did not flee. He stood, serene, waiting for death, as though execution itself was part of the plan. How do you defend against such an enemy? Walls cannot stop them. Bribes cannot tempt them. Threats cannot silence them. They do not fear death. On the contrary, they embrace it as the final step of their mission. And that is why fear became their sharpest weapon. Inside Alamut, Hassan instilled a simple philosophy. You cannot fight empires with armies, but you can break them with fear. You do not need to destroy a kingdom. You only need to plant doubt in the minds of its rulers. Make them question their guards, their servants, even their own family. Make them wake in the night, unsure if the smile they saw in the marketplace belonged to a pilgrim or to their executioner. One dagger, placed in the right hand at the right moment, could topple empires more effectively than 10,000 soldiers, and it worked. The first blood came with the assassination of Nizam al-Mulk, the Seljuk vizier who was the true architect of Seljuk power, a man feared and respected across the Islamic world, a man who believed the assassins were nothing more than worms gnawing at the roots of his empire. But in 1092, during pilgrimage, a stranger approached him. He looked harmless, perhaps a wandering mystic, a man of faith, yet hidden in his robe was steel. With a single thrust, Nizam al-Mulk fell, his lifeblood staining the ground. The assassin was cut down instantly, but he did not resist, did not cry out. He smiled, and in that moment, the Seljuk Empire realized it had been pierced by something it could not understand. The death of one man might not seem enough to shake a dynasty, but the true weapon was not the blade. It was the silence that followed. Whispers filled the court. If the vizier could be killed, who was safe? Kings no longer trusted their guards. Clerics hesitated before preaching against the Ismailis. Ministers looked over their shoulders in crowded halls. And ordinary people, hearing the rumors in the market, felt their own world darken with dread. Fear spread like smoke, seeping under doors, curling through corridors, choking even those who had never seen an assassin with their own eyes. And here let us pause, because this is where the true brilliance of Hassan's vision reveals itself. The assassins did not need to kill thousands. They needed only to kill a handful of the right men at the right time. The rumor, the paranoia, the constant shadow, that did the rest. Think about it, even today, one act of terror can change the world for decades. One hijacking alters airport security forever. One assassination rewrites alliances. Fear outlives the dead. It lingers, it multiplies, it rots the foundations of power. That is why Hassan's men were so dangerous. They understood that fear is not the absence of strength. It is a weapon more devastating than any army. From that first strike, the legend grew. Some said the assassins could vanish into thin air. Others claimed they drank hashish to enter frenzied trances, impervious to pain. Still others swore they had seen assassins walk calmly into a king's court, stab him in daylight, and then bow their heads as if fulfilling a sacred ritual. Truth and rumor blurred. Fact dissolved into myth. And Hassan smiled from his mountain fortress, for he knew that myth was the deadliest poison of all. The assassination of Nizam al-Mulk was not merely the end of a man's life. It was the tearing of a veil, the ripping open of a certainty that had long protected the Seljuk throne. Until that day, the vizier had seemed untouchable, a pillar of stability, the voice that carried the weight of an empire. But as his blood darkened the soil, the Seljuk elite realized something dreadful. No matter how high their walls, no matter how loyal their soldiers, no matter how deeply their palaces were buried in stone and marble, they were never safe. The vizier had been surrounded by guards, armed men sworn to protect him, and still the assassin's dagger found its mark. What did it matter that the killer died moments later? He had already won, for in striking down Nizam al-Mulk, the assassins had struck down the very illusion of safety. The court of Sultan Malik Shah descended into whispers. Advisors looked at each other with narrowed eyes, unsure who might already be compromised. The Sultan himself, once confident in his divine mandate, now shifted from chamber to chamber at night, unable to sleep in the same bed twice. His wives and servants noticed the change. He spoke less. He trusted less. He kept his most private thoughts locked behind clenched teeth, because what if the man pouring his wine, the eunuch fanning him in the summer heat, or the guard at the door had already been touched by Alamut's shadow? Even paranoia once planted grows roots, and it did not stop with the court. In the markets of Isfahan and Baghdad, merchants muttered about the killing, their voices dropping when strangers passed by. Mothers warned their children not to speak the name of Hassan-i Sabbah aloud, for fear that someone might be listening. Clerics who had once thundered against the Ismailis began to soften their words, or else fell silent altogether, their eyes darting toward the back of the mosque, as if at any moment a dagger might flash among the worshippers. And the people, the ordinary masses who had nothing to do with politics, still felt the chill. Because if a vizier could be slain in daylight, what hope had they of being protected from such invisible killers? Fear began to stretch its claws further than any blade could reach. And this was Hassan's true design. Alamut was not just a fortress of stone. It was a fortress of silence, of rumor, of myth. The dagger was the seed, but fear was the harvest, and it spread like wildfire. Legends blossomed. Some claimed the assassins were not men at all, but demons disguised in human form. Others whispered that they had made pacts with jinn, that they could walk through walls, that no lock, no door, no fortress could keep them out. A traveler in Damascus swore he had seen an assassin leap from the minaret of a mosque, vanish into smoke, and reappear unharmed. In Cairo, stories circulated that they were fed visions of paradise, gardens of wine and houris, drugged with hashish and promised eternal bliss if they carried out their master's will. Whether these stories were true mattered little. What mattered was that people believed them, and belief, when infected by fear, is the most unshakable prison of all. Hassan-i Sabbah understood this better than anyone. He did not need to kill thousands, he needed only a few blades, placed in the right hands, at the right time. The rest of the work would be done by imagination. The mind of a king, already heavy with worries of war and rebellion, would gnaw itself apart, wondering if the smiling servant beside him had sworn loyalty to Alamut. The hand of a scholar, steady on the page, would tremble when he thought of the punishment for speaking too loudly against the sect. Fear turned even ordinary men into instruments of silence, and in that silence the assassins thrived. The Seljuk Empire, though still mighty on paper, began to fracture under the weight of suspicion. Generals doubted their own lieutenants. Rulers hesitated to gather in public. Invitations to banquets were declined for fear of poison. Political rivals accused each other of harboring assassins, and executions were carried out not on evidence, but on whispers. The assassins had planted their deadliest seed, mistrust. And mistrust is a slow poison that empires cannot survive. But while rulers quaked and clerics censored their tongues, Alamut itself was quiet. From the outside, no one knew what occurred within its walls. Those who tried to infiltrate often vanished. Some returned with vacant stares, unable to speak of what they had seen. The fortress became more than a fortress, it became a myth. To some, it was a paradise of gardens and pools where young men were bewitched into loyalty. To others, it was a library of forbidden knowledge where truths too dangerous for kings or caliphs were preserved. To still others, it was a temple of death, a factory where boys were remade into killers who no longer felt the touch of fear. Which of these was true? Perhaps none, perhaps all. The uncertainty was the point, and this, I believe, is the most terrifying aspect of the assassins. Not their blades, not their killings, but their mastery of uncertainty. In our world today, we are often told that knowledge is power. But Hassan-i Sabbah seemed to understand a darker truth. Ignorance carefully cultivated can be even more powerful. The less his enemies knew, the more they imagined. And imagination filled with fear is a weapon that never misses its mark. Years passed and the pattern repeated. Viziers, judges, generals. A preacher silenced mid-sermon. A governor found dead in his chambers. A noble struck down in the street. Each killing carried the same signature, not the dagger itself, but the serenity of the killer who neither fled nor begged, but welcomed his own death as if it were the final verse of a prayer. And each killing carried the same echo, the whisper that the hand of Alamut had reached out once more. And so the name spread. Hashashin, assassin. A word that was at first a slur, meant to strip them of dignity, became instead a curse, a warning, a ghost that lingered in the halls of power. No one wanted to speak it aloud, but no one could forget it. It crept into dreams. It appeared in the anxious glances of guards standing watch at palace gates. It seeped into the cracks of empire like a shadow that could not be burned away. By the time the crusaders came thundering into the Holy Land, the legend of the assassins had already crossed mountains and deserts. They were no longer just a sect in the Persian hills. They had become something larger, something timeless. To Muslim rulers, they were heretics, but also a threat too dangerous to underestimate. To Christian lords, they were at first an enigma, then a terror. For the assassins did not care whether their victim prayed facing Mecca or Jerusalem. They cared only for those who threatened their cause. And so, kings of both Cross and Crescent began to learn the same lesson. There is no fortress high enough, no guard loyal enough, no prayer strong enough to protect you when the shadow of Alamut chooses to fall. The Crusades had drenched the soil of the Middle East with blood, long before the assassins revealed themselves to the Christians. From the first call of Pope Urban II in 1095, waves of knights and soldiers surged from Europe into lands they considered holy, carrying not just crosses stitched into their banners, but hunger for land, riches, and eternal salvation. To the Muslim kingdoms already torn by their own rivalries, the Crusaders were a storm of steel from a distant horizon. Cities fell, thousands were slaughtered, and the balance of power shifted with each campaign. Yet amid this chaos, there was a third presence, smaller than armies, quieter than states, yet more terrifying than both: the assassins. At first, the Crusaders did not understand what they were facing. Their enemies, they believed, were the Muslims in general, the Seljuks, the Fatimids, the defenders of Jerusalem. Yet then, whispers began to spread among their own camps. A count dead in the night. A prince cut down in broad daylight. 2 men with daggers striking swiftly, and then calmly surrendering to their deaths. These were not the chaotic battles of war. These were precise, deliberate killings. And the Crusaders had no name for such enemies until they learned the word the locals already feared: Hashashin. The most infamous of these killings came in the year 1192, when the Crusader states, fragile and divided, saw the rise of a man who might have united them: Conrad of Montferrat. Bold, shrewd, and ambitious, Conrad had maneuvered his way to being elected king of Jerusalem. For the Christians, he was a potential savior who could stabilize their grasp on the Holy Land. For the assassins, he was a threat, a man whose alliances and ambitions cut across their delicate balance of survival. The tale is chilling in its simplicity. Just days after his election, Conrad walked the streets of Tyre, confident in his new crown, though not yet seated on the throne. The city bustled with noise, markets alive with voices, guards flanking him as he strode forward. No one expected danger in such a public space. And then, without warning, 2 men stepped from the crowd. They did not shout. They did not threaten. They simply drew daggers and plunged them into Conrad's body. The king-elect collapsed in the dirt, blood spilling across the stones. The crowd screamed. The guards seized the attackers instantly, cutting them down. Yet as with all who came from Alamut, they showed no fear. One even smiled faintly as he was struck down, as though death itself was the completion of his purpose. To the Crusaders, this was a nightmare beyond comprehension. How could such men exist? Men who killed not for coin, not for plunder, but for an idea. To the Christian knights raised on notions of honor, glory, and survival, this was unthinkable. And yet here it was. 2 faceless men, nameless even in death, altering the course of kingdoms with the quiet thrust of a blade. The shockwaves were immense. Rumors spread that Richard the Lionheart himself might have orchestrated the murder, or perhaps his rival Guy of Lusignan. Others insisted it was the assassins acting on their own, sending a message to all who sought to dominate the fragile balance of the region. No one could say with certainty, and that uncertainty was the deadliest part. For once again, Hassan's legacy was at work. Fear born not from what was known, but from what could never be proven. And this fear crossed oceans. In Europe, troubadours and chroniclers carried tales of the mysterious sect who lived in mountain fortresses, who trained their men with drugs and visions, who sent them to die with smiles on their lips. In the taverns of Paris and the halls of Venice, people whispered of the assassins as if they were phantoms, demons who could reach across continents to strike down kings. A dagger in the streets of Tyre had become a shadow in the minds of men who had never set foot in the East. But the truth, as always, was more complex. The assassins were not agents of chaos. They were not random killers. They were guardians of a fragile equilibrium, striking only those whose actions threatened their survival. Sometimes that meant Muslim rulers, sometimes Christian kings. They did not discriminate between cross and crescent. They hunted only those who endangered their cause. To the Crusaders, this made them even more terrifying, for they could not be classified simply as enemies of Christendom. They were something else, something older, something deeper. A third force, silent and untouchable. Imagine being a knight in the Crusades, hardened by battles, scarred by sieges, accustomed to the clash of steel and the cries of war. And then imagine that as you feast in a hall, you notice a servant's eyes linger too long on your face. Or as you kneel in prayer, you feel a hand brush past you in the crowd. Suddenly, you are not afraid of armies or sieges. You are afraid of silence, of proximity, of the unseen. That is what the assassins brought to the Crusades, a new kind of warfare, one that no sword could parry. Even rulers who once threatened them learned to bow before the invisible hand of Alamut. Richard the Lionheart, it is said, once received a dagger placed beside his sleeping envoy's bed, a silent gesture from the assassins that if they wished, his heart would already be pierced. No letter, no demand, no negotiation. Just the message: we are watching. Whether the story is truth or myth no longer matters. What matters is that men believed it. And belief was enough to shake the courage of even the bravest kings. The Crusades raged on, battles won and lost, kingdoms built and shattered. But throughout it all, the assassins remained in the shadows, never commanding armies, never raising banners, yet altering the tides of history with the death of a single man. They were not conquerors of land, they were conquerors of certainty. And in a world soaked in blood, where every empire sought to declare itself eternal, they proved a darker truth. That eternity can be broken by a single blade, wielded by a man who no longer fears his own death. The death of Conrad of Montferrat was not an isolated act, it was a revelation. It proved to the Crusaders that the assassins were not bound by alliances, nor by faith, nor by the politics of East or West. They were a storm without a flag, a shadow that could fall on anyone. And soon the Crusader states learned that Conrad was only the first. In the years that followed, whispers of more killings crept through the courts of the Levant. Governors cut down in their palaces, commanders slain at the gates of their own strongholds. Sometimes the strikes came in daylight, amid the roar of markets. Sometimes they came in silence in a darkened chamber, where only the victim's final breath broke the night. Each death carried the same pattern: calm killers who did not flee, who accepted their capture and death as if it were the fulfillment of their vow. Each death carried the same echo: Alamut has acted. One account tells of a prominent Crusader knight who had long spoken against the assassins, mocking their courage, dismissing their power. He called them cowards hiding in shadows, claiming no true soldier of Christ would fear such ghosts. Weeks later, as he left the church after evening prayer, two figures emerged from the crowd. Before his guards could react, they struck, and the night collapsed on the stones of the courtyard, blood spilling across the steps of the sanctuary. The killers were seized, but they did not cry out, did not struggle. They smiled faintly as if to say, "Your arrogance was your undoing." Another tale whispered among both Muslim and Christian chroniclers tells of a cleric who preached loudly against the Ismailis, calling them heretics, warning his flock that they were demons in human form. For months, his voice echoed in the streets, condemning them with fiery words. And then one morning his body was found slumped against the very pulpit from which he had thundered, a dagger buried in his chest. No one saw the killer enter. No one saw him leave. Only the silence remained. And in that silence, people wondered not just who had struck the blow, but how long the assassin had been sitting among the congregation, listening, waiting, invisible in plain sight. Even Saladin, the great Muslim general who united Egypt and Syria against the Crusaders, was not spared from the shadow. For years, Saladin had waged campaigns against the assassins, besieging their strongholds, vowing to erase them from history. But one night, as he slept in his encampment, an assassin slipped past the guards. He approached Saladin's bed with a dagger drawn, ready to end the life of the man who had become a legend of his age. But fate intervened. A guard, switching shifts earlier than expected, caught sight of the intruder. The assassin was seized, executed, and Saladin's life was spared. Yet from that night on, the great commander never slept without a guard at his side. He never again dared to underestimate the assassins. Their blade had missed its mark, but the fear had struck true. And this was the secret of their terror. Even when they failed, they succeeded. A missed strike was not a defeat. It was a reminder that death had brushed so close it could almost be tasted. For Saladin, the message was clear. We can reach you, we can touch you, and one day we may not miss. He no longer sought to annihilate them. Instead, he fell silent, perhaps even negotiated in secret, for he knew that the assassins could not be crushed by sword alone. The Crusaders too learned this lesson. Some rulers began to send gifts and tributes to Alamut, buying a fragile peace in exchange for their lives. Gold, silks, and promises crossed the mountains, not because kings admired Hassan's successors, but because they feared the invisible hand that could snuff them out at any moment. Imagine the humiliation. Christian lords, sworn to fight infidels in the name of God, sending quiet offerings to the very sect they denounced in public. But humiliation was better than death. And so the assassins gained not just survival, but influence, an invisible weight pressing on the scales of politics. What terrified both Christians and Muslims alike was not only the killings themselves, but their brazenness. These were not murders committed in secret alleys, hidden in the shadows of night. Many were carried out in broad daylight in full view of crowds. A ruler might fall as he left a mosque, or a noble might be struck down as he sat among advisors. The killers did not flee because they did not need to. Their deaths were part of the message. Each act was a theater of terror, a performance designed to echo in the minds of witnesses, and echo it did. Even in Europe, far from the mountains of Persia, stories of the assassins grew. Chroniclers described them as demons raised in secret gardens, drugged with potions, shown visions of paradise so vivid that they would do anything to return. Whether this was truth or slander no longer mattered. To peasants in France, to nobles in England, the very word assassin became a curse, a whisper that could make the bravest knight glance over his shoulder. A shadow from the east had stretched across the world, and even men who had never seen an assassin now feared their hand. And so the Crusades became more than a clash of armies. They became a stage upon which the assassins proved their philosophy, that power is not measured in banners or armies, but in the quiet terror planted in a man's heart. Kings built castles, raised armies, minted coins, but none of it mattered when a stranger could step from the crowd, smile politely, and then strike. In the end, the Crusaders learned a truth their enemies already knew. There is no fortress high enough, no prayer strong enough, no crown heavy enough to protect a man from the shadow of Alamut. For centuries, the chronicles of the assassins spoke almost exclusively of men. Fida, who struck with daggers, who died smiling, who turned fear into a weapon sharper than steel. But the truth, hidden in fragments of memory and whispered legends, suggests that the order would never have endured without the silent presence of women. They do not appear in the heroic ballads of crusaders, nor in the fearful accounts of viziers, nor in the fiery sermons of clerics. Their names were not recorded, their faces were never carved into stone. Yet within the fortress of Alamut, it was they who kept the flame alive when the world outside sought to extinguish it. The fortress was not merely a school for killers, it was a sanctuary of knowledge. And knowledge cannot survive without guardians. Women within the community, though invisible to history, served as healers, teachers, keepers of texts. They knew the properties of herbs, poisons, and antidotes, preparing the bodies of young Fida for missions from which they would never return. They tended to wounds, but more than that, they nurtured conviction. A boy who entered Alamut at 15 may have spent long nights not only in philosophical training, but in the quiet care of women who whispered reminders that his sacrifice had meaning, that his life was part of a greater design. Such care did not make the dagger sharper, but it made the hand steadier. There are tales, half legend, half memory, of women who played more direct roles. One story tells of a young wife who lived with her target for months, her gentle eyes hiding a heart of iron. She played the role perfectly, dutiful, affectionate, harmless. Until the day came when her hand moved like lightning and a blade found its mark. Her face was never recorded, her name never spoken, yet her act lived in rumor, a chilling reminder that even the softness of love could conceal the silence of death. And in the deepest chambers of Alamut, beyond the training halls and libraries, some say women preserved the secret knowledge of the order. They became keepers of manuscripts, guardians of symbols, interpreters of codes. In a world where kings dismissed them as powerless, their very invisibility became their shield. No one suspected the hand that copied a manuscript. No one feared the woman who moved silently among the fortress halls. And so they carried within them the most dangerous power of all. Knowledge that could outlive empires. But the assassins did not rely only on people. They wove their existence into a tapestry of signs and signals, a hidden language that only the initiated could read. A dagger placed upright in a door frame, a strip of black cloth tied to a tree, a coin etched with a tower left on a table. To an outsider, these were meaningless. To a Fida, They were commands. Go, wait, strike. Messages traveled across deserts and mountains without words, carried not by couriers, but by the silent agreement of symbols. Imagine the terror of their enemies. A governor wakes to find a blade embedded in the wall beside his bed. No note, no blood, only the promise of what could come. And he knows, without being told, that Alamut has marked him. What defense can he raise against a message written in silence? Armies cannot stop a shadow, and walls cannot keep out a symbol that arrives without footsteps. This network was not only practical, it was philosophical. The assassins believed truth itself was hidden, layered beneath symbols and allegories. To them, the Quran was not merely law, but cipher. To live as a fida was to live in layers of meaning, where every gesture could be a code, every parable a command, every silence a message. Their entire existence was a riddle that only those inside the order could hope to solve. Modern historians have struggled to piece together these fragments, for the assassins left little in writing. Their words were cloaked in poetry, their commands disguised as stories, their rituals never recorded in plain language. What survives are echoes, accounts from enemies, hints in architecture, fragments of verse, and perhaps this was deliberate, for secrecy was not only a shield, it was their very identity. A member captured could reveal nothing, because he knew only his fragment of the design. A woman could copy texts without ever knowing their full meaning. A symbol carved into a wall could carry a message across empires without a single word being written. This was the brilliance of Alamut's hidden web. It turned the ordinary into the terrifying. A strip of cloth, a coin, a dagger in a wall. To outsiders, nothing. To insiders, everything. And to their enemies, the uncertainty was unbearable. Was that coin dropped by chance? Was that servant a loyal hand or a waiting blade? Was that story told by a wandering mystic simply parable? Or was it a command from Hassan himself? And here lies the most haunting thought. What if the assassins never truly vanished, but only dissolved into the silence they had always inhabited? If their language was built from symbols so subtle that only the faithful could see, then perhaps they did not die with Alamut. Perhaps they only changed shape, flowing like water into new vessels, hidden beneath the surfaces of societies that never knew they were there. A gesture, a phrase, a pause too long in a sentence. Could these not still be the remnants of a code echoing across centuries? Women's symbols, silence, these were not the weapons history remembers. Yet without them, the assassins would have been nothing more than a handful of men with knives. With them, they became a force that kings feared, priests denounced, and entire empires hesitated to face. For armies can be seen, banners can be burned, but the invisible cannot be destroyed. And it was in the hands of the invisible, the women who nurtured, the symbols that whispered, that the true power of the assassins endured. For nearly 2 centuries, the assassins had defied kings, sultans, viziers, crusader lords, and even the great Saladin himself. They had endured not because of armies or walls, but because of fear, secrecy, and the patience of men willing to die for a cause. But no shadow can linger forever, and every fortress, no matter how high it stands, must one day face a storm it cannot withstand. For Alamut, that storm came not from the west, not from crusader knights or Seljuk rulers, but from the east, from the most relentless tide of destruction the medieval world had ever known. The Mongols. The Mongols were unlike any enemy the assassins had faced before. Empires feared the assassins because they struck with the invisible hand of death. But the Mongols feared nothing at all. They did not tremble at whispers. They did not hesitate before omens. They burned cities to the ground, slaughtered entire populations, and left deserts where gardens once bloomed. Baghdad, the jewel of Islam, the seat of the Caliph, had been reduced to ashes beneath their hooves. Libraries of ancient wisdom were drowned in rivers, their pages blackening the water like ink spilled from the veins of history itself. To such men, what was Alamut but another stone fortress perched on a mountain ridge? Hulagu Khan, grandson of the great Genghis, led the campaign against Persia. Cold, methodical, merciless, he understood that to truly control the land, the assassins had to be erased. For as long as their daggers hung over the throats of rulers, no empire could rest easy. And so, in the year 1256, Hulagu turned his gaze toward the Alborz mountains, where Alamut crouched like a serpent among the cliffs. The siege was unlike those that had come before. Other empires had sent armies only to falter before the narrow path, the hidden archers, the treacherous slopes. They had underestimated the fortress, thinking only of stone and steel, never of the silence within. But the Mongols brought with them the greatest siegecraft of the age, engineers who built towers that could crawl up mountain paths, catapults that hurled fire and stone with unrelenting force, men so disciplined that fears seemed to bounce off their armor like arrows on rock. And perhaps for the first time in their history, the assassins knew they could not win. Inside Alamut, the Fida must have felt the walls closing in. Did they prepare for battle? Did they sharpen their daggers and whisper prayers of sacrifice? Or did they, in their quiet chambers, reflect on Hassan's philosophy? That true power was never in stone, but in belief. Some chronicles suggest that, as the Mongols approached, the assassins burned their own library, destroying texts that had been guarded for generations. Knowledge, philosophy, codes, erased by their own hands lest they fall into the grip of their enemies. Others claim the archives were hidden, scattered in secret places, waiting for the day they might be uncovered again. No one knows for certain. But when the Mongols breached the fortress, they found little more than ashes. The fall of Alamut was not marked by a glorious last stand, nor by the thunder of battle. It was marked by silence. The kind of silence that clings to ruins after the fire has burned out. The kind of silence that feels deliberate, as though the fortress itself had chosen to erase its secrets rather than let them be desecrated. Hulagu's men marched through its halls, but they found no treasure, no leaders to parade in chains, no hidden armories. Only empty chambers, charred manuscripts, defaced carvings, as if the assassins had dissolved into the very stone. And yet, even in their destruction, the assassins had their victory. For while Alamut fell, their legend did not. The Mongols could burn fortresses, slaughter followers, scatter survivors into the wind. But they could not kill the fear that lingered. They could not erase the memory of viziers cut down in pilgrimage, of kings trembling in their halls, of crusader princes slain in broad daylight. The Mongols could annihilate bodies, but they could not annihilate the shadow. Perhaps that is why, long after 1256, long after Alamut was reduced to rubble, whispers of the assassins still haunted the courts of rulers. Some claimed survivors had fled to distant mountains, building smaller fortresses hidden in fog. Others believed they had melted into ordinary communities, carrying with them fragments of the creed, symbols etched into memory, rituals performed in silence. And some even dared to wonder whether the assassins had chosen their own disappearance, scattering like dust so that their enemies would never truly know if they were gone. To this day, historians debate whether the fall of Alamut was an ending or a transformation. Did the assassins vanish, consumed by the fire of Mongol conquest? Or did they, like shadows at dusk, simply change shape, becoming harder to see, but never truly absent? The ruins of Alamut still sit in the mountains, silent and broken, the wind sighing through its stones. But listen closely, and perhaps you might still hear it, the faint scrape of a blade drawn from its sheath, the whisper of a vow spoken in the dark. The Mongols destroyed a fortress, they destroyed an army. But they did not destroy the idea, and that, in the end, is the most terrifying truth of all. Though Alamut lay in ruins, though the Mongols scattered its people and burned its libraries, the assassins did not truly die. For what the Mongols destroyed was stone and flesh. What they could never destroy was the shadow, and shadows have a way of seeping into the cracks of history, surviving in silence long after their bodies have turned to dust. In the centuries that followed, the word assassin drifted across continents like smoke. In the Middle East, the memory lingered as both terror and fascination. To many, they were heretics cursed by God. To others, they were martyrs who had dared to defy empires with nothing but conviction. In Europe, the stories grew even stranger. Chroniclers like Marco Polo spoke of gardens of paradise, of young men drugged and deceived into loyalty by visions of eternal bliss. Scholars debated whether they were sorcerers, devils, or philosophers of death. The truth dissolved into legend, and legend became myth. Yet behind every myth was the haunting certainty that somewhere, once, men had walked this earth who looked at death and smiled. Over time, the word assassin broke free from its roots. It became a term for any killer, any blade turned against the powerful. Yet in its echo was always something more, a sense of purpose, of sacrifice, of belief. A common murderer kills for coin. An assassin, as the world came to understand it, kills for something higher, something unseen. And that distinction has made the word endure across centuries. But their true legacy was not the killings themselves. It was the idea they left behind, that no system of power is untouchable, that no ruler is beyond reach, that fear is the most enduring weapon of all. This idea resurfaced again and again, in different guises in different centuries. Secret societies of Europe, Templars, Freemasons, Illuminati, were whispered to carry fragments of their philosophy, their symbols, their rituals. Revolutionaries of the Enlightenment borrowed their image as a metaphor for resisting kings and tyrants. Poets and writers cast them as knights of shadows, men who acted outside law for the sake of truth. Whether any of this was real no longer mattered. The silhouette of the assassin had escaped the mountains and entered the human imagination, where no empire could erase it. And in the modern age, the shadow only grew longer. In novels, in films, in whispered conspiracy theories, the assassins lived again. They appeared in masked rebels who fought oppressive systems, in lone figures who struck at governments too vast to challenge directly, in symbols of resistance that could not be bought or silenced. The most vivid resurrection came in the world of video games, where the Assassin's Creed series reimagined them as warriors of freedom, fighting against hidden tyrannies. Fictional, yes, but resonant, because somewhere in our modern hearts, we still feel the same dread and the same longing. Dread that unseen forces govern us without our knowledge, and longing that someone somewhere might still be brave enough to strike back in the shadows. Even beyond fiction, the assassin's spirit lingers. Consider the whistleblower who leaks forbidden truths, knowing death or prison may follow. Consider the hacker who slips unseen through digital walls to expose secrets empires would rather keep buried. Consider the protester who stands alone before the machinery of the state, ready to be crushed but refusing to move. They do not call themselves assassins, yet their resolve echoes the creed of Alamut. Act in silence, sacrifice the self, and strike where the world least expects. And perhaps this is why the story of the assassins chills us even now. Because it forces us to ask a question no king, no system, no individual wishes to confront. If one person sees evil clearly, undeniably, and has only a single chance to stop it, should they act? The assassins did not ask, they acted. And the world has never forgotten. So the ruins of Alamut remain, stones weathered by centuries, silence draped over the mountains like a shroud. Tourists may climb its paths, historians may dig through its rubble, but the real fortress was never the stone. It was the philosophy carried in whispers, in rituals, in symbols etched into memory. That fortress still stands, and in the modern world, where surveillance watches every move and power grows more absolute, the shadow of the assassin feels closer than ever. Perhaps they are gone, or perhaps they are still among us, not with daggers, but with codes, with truths, with acts of defiance too quiet to be traced. Perhaps every anonymous hand that writes what no one else dares to say carries a fragment of their legacy. Perhaps every shadow on a crowded street holds the ghost of Alamut, and that is why the word assassin still makes us shiver. Not because of the bodies they left behind, but because of the silence that remains. A silence that whispers, the world is never as safe as you think. So if tonight you feel a chill, if you glance over your shoulder at the sound of a footstep, if you hesitate when a stranger smiles too long, remember this. It is not death itself that terrifies. It is the thought that somewhere, unseen, a hand has already chosen the moment when you will fall. It is the legacy of the assassins. Not the blade, not the fortress, but the shadow. And that is why the word assassin still makes us shiver. Not because of the bodies they left behind, but because of the silence that remains. A silence that whispers, the world is never as safe as you think. So if tonight you feel a chill, if you glance over your shoulder at the sound of a footstep, remember, the shadow may still be there. That is the legacy of the assassins. Not the blade, not the fortress, but the shadow. And if this journey into the shadows of history stirred something in you, don't forget to like this video. Share it with those who love dark history and subscribe. Because the past still holds secrets waiting to be uncovered, and we will uncover them together.